I'm a psychologist, and towards the end of my PhD over here at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I don't remember if I wrote it up or what, but I'm also co-founder of an organization called Shoval, and we're the only organization that's both recommended by the Israeli government, as well as focusing on specifically LGBT competency training within religious organizations. So we run about 50 sessions a year. By now, we've already shifted to online Zoom trainings like these. Back when we were able to get together, we've been running conferences. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about is kind of some of the lessons that we've learned along the way, and especially through the many, many clinical conversations that we've had, as well as some of our own personal clinical experience, some of the messages that kind of I would like for you all to be taking away when we're talking about this topic. Okay, so first of all, just to get into the structure of the talk, this is something that we could spend years and years just talking about this particular intersection right over here. I decided that the way that I would prefer to structure it, especially with what we're dealing with here, I want to give kind of 3 TED Talk style talks about some specific topics. Okay, first of all, I'll be focusing specifically on homosexuality and the Abrahamic religions. Okay, that's going to be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The idea there being that, without going into the text and really having closer reading, a little bit of a closer understanding, we ourselves may end up missing a lot of the subtext of what's going on within that conversation. Okay, next we're already going to take it into direct clinical relevance. We're going to be talking about sexual and gender minority experiences as well as religious experiences, and what we can do as therapists to help people recognize both of those identities and take steps towards maybe even integrating them. And finally, I was actually very happy to see that a lot of people asked about this because this was something that I was going to bring up myself. It's important in general, and especially here, for us to understand the familial context, what the person's experience is within their family, and how we can work with either the LGBT plus client of ours or with their family. Okay, but either way, there is some working through which needs to be done. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Okay, and at the end of each of those topics, I'll open it up for a little bit of discussion. And I imagine at the end, at least very much, hopefully, we'll have time for a longer discussion. We'll see what we want to go more in depth into. Okay, just in terms of setting some expectations here in advance, first of all, with much respect to the research and the theory, I will be bringing in a lot of theory. Unfortunately, there's not so much research into this area yet. But from what I understood, this is more of a clinical setting and a clinical discussion. So I'm going to place more of an emphasis on what actually happens within the room. So I'll talk about the theory. That will certainly be the framework for what we're working with. But there's not going to be an easy straight line, right? Integrating the many parts of your identity is just not simple phobia. So get ready. Along with that, this is mostly because of time, but also just this is where we're going to be going. I want to offer you some frameworks and ways of thinking about it, be that in terms of putting together your clinical presentation and how you're going to be thinking about the therapy. But also, you're going to see that every person is different, right? Identities, by definition, change from person to person, and interactions between identities all the more so. Okay, so it's going to be less important when we think about this topic to consider, the A, B, C, this is exactly what you must do, and more important for us to think about how we're going to be approaching these kinds of questions, and then taking those frameworks and applying it to the different individuals in our therapy. I'm just going to ask for nodding every now and then. Is that point clear? Okay, great. And finally, this is really important no matter who you're talking to about this topic. I'm taking a descriptive approach, not a proscriptive approach. Okay, that means we're going to be placing more of an emphasis on how things are and not necessarily on how things should be. Okay, so we're going to take that little judgmental voice in our head about which community is right, which identity is correct, all of that, and we're going to put that down for a second. Okay, it's important for us, in order to understand the worldview of these clients of ours, to understand what these voices are saying before we even get to the step of evaluating whether we agree with it or not. Okay, so that's the general overview. The first thing that I want to get into is I'm going to be focusing here specifically on homosexuality. Okay, so the G and the L here, and the Abrahamic religions. The reason why is because, first of all, when people talk about this topic, they usually cite within the Old Testament, Leviticus 18:22, right, that a man shall not lie with another man as with a woman. It is a toeva. It's usually translated as abomination. A more direct translation is not exactly what we do. Okay, certain forms of things which are not kosher are also called a toeva, abominations. It ended up, because of translations, getting a very, very loaded term. But the main idea being that this is not something that we as a people do. Just a show from the crowd, is this a line that people have heard of before? Do people know that this is part of the discourse? Okay, usually this is the first thing that people jump to. When you're a little bit more involved in the discourse and you start reading some of the subtext, while people jump to this verse, much more often the subtext is talking about a different story. Okay, now we're in Genesis 19. Okay, in this story, angels visited the house of Lot when he was in Sodom. Okay, so the text goes, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them. The implication being know them in a biblical sense. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. Keep in mind, these men are actually angels, right? Because in the next verse, they struck the men of Sodom with blindness, the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. I know this story is out there. Why am I bringing it up? Because usually in the discourse, when people are talking about specifically somebody coming out of the closet, the way that they envision the greater LGBT plus community, this is usually the image that they have in their heads, right? When we talk about the way that Sodom is usually referred to and usually interpreted, the phrase which comes to my mind, at least, is one of moral anarchy, right? Now, while maybe the origin of the text, while it did involve homosexual rape, right? The subtext, which was in that story in particular, was really taking advantage of the weak, right? That every person in the community would come together and they found that this person was an alien in their midst, and this was their opportunity to completely oppress them. But as we're going to see a little bit later, the fact that it was specifically of a homosexual nature is later interpreted as something which is just a symptom of greater moral decay. Okay, so the things to be aware of in general when we talk about Sodom and sodomy and the way that all of that is imagined, again, is that first of all, it's greater moral decay, moral anarchy, people who are really turning their backs on God. Okay, and second of all, as a result of that, a symptom of, let's say, giving into uncontrollable lusts, the expression ends up being homosexual. Okay, now that's not just something which remained in the Old Testament. You can look in the New Testament as well. There's plenty of citations of the Sodom story, which comes up in a variety of different contexts. Just one of them, do you know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkard, revilers, robbers. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. And this is what some of you used to be. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. Now, again, just in terms of understanding what the discourse is here, right? First of all, anybody who falls into any of these categories are people who are not acting as someone who was sanctified, right? Who is part of the servants of God. Second of all, people who are sodomites, in this case, have a look at everybody else which they're being brought in with together. They're being thrown in with the fornicators and the adulterers and the male prostitutes, right? It's not only being a servant to your own lust. Okay, it's also being a servant to just whatever is no longer holy, and kind of giving up the control and the self-regulation, which is supposed to come with being part of this community, and saying, forget all of it. What you hear about very, very often, especially in Israel, but in most religious communities, just giving into your passions. Okay, we see other signs of it within the Quran as well. And we sent out Lot, and when he said to his people, what do you commit an indecency which anyone in the world has not done before you? Most surely you come to males in lust besides females. Nay, you are an extravagant people. Right here it's laid out pretty explicitly. Right, it was a sin of extravagance and a sin of just excessive lust. Why do I bring up all of these verses? Because the first main takeaway that I want to give to all of you is that usually when people talk about this conflict, they jump to the line of the abomination, right? That a man who lies with another man, like with a woman, is considered an abomination before God. While that is usually the text of what is cited, the subtext is a greater cultural assumption about what's going on here. Okay, part of this is, you could blame on the media. Part of it is just, there is some reflection of that in reality. But if you imagine a parent who raised their children to be modest, who raised their children to go to church, to be monogamous, right? And then the next thing you know, they're seeing pictures, let's say from New York City Pride. What I've heard many times in many of the sessions that I've done in salons, I don't have a problem with my kid being gay. I have my problem with my kid jumping headfirst into gay culture. Okay, and a lot of times with our clients themselves, that's really a lot of what they feel as well, especially at the beginning, where all their knowledge of the queer community is going to be through either social media or pictures that they see in the news and things like that. Before you have any kind of close-up connection with people who are actually in the community, the only image that you have in your head is usually going to be one which is very, very dissonant from the way that you were raised. Okay, so the original issue, I think a lot of times, we think of the story being they were raised to hate themselves, they were raised and sent to conversion therapy and traumatized, and very often that does happen. What is more typical is I was raised according to one social paradigm, and now all of a sudden I need to readjust. That's the perfect example, actually, of what I'm about to get to next. So thank you for that very much. Just, do we have time? Yeah, we have time for one more question or comment if there is. All right, we're going to keep going. So let's talk about what happens when these points meet, right? Because we're coming into it from the perspective where while religion may be prescribing a certain set of ideals, we have people where those set of ideals, at least at the very first reading, aren't consistent with their lived experience. And more importantly, the experience that they want to continue or maybe start living in the future. I've found that one framework which has been very useful, especially for therapists to work with here, is called acculturation theory. Okay, you can see at the bottom, the original paper, which kind of set it forward, is at the bottom of the screen. But the main idea is that anybody who is finding their place between two different cultures or two different identities, there's kind of two different ways that they could deal with them. It's presented as categorical, of course, it's dimensional. So first, let's talk about somebody's native culture. Okay, Barry at the time was talking about it in terms of immigrants. It's something which has already been applied to all sorts of other examples. Okay, in this case, the native culture is somebody's religious background, right? And in terms of their original culture from which they came, they have the dimension of how much they want to retain it and keep it as part of their identity and part of their practice, and how much they want to reject it. And on the flip side, they have their host culture. Now again, acculturation theory is something which applies to whatever you want to apply it to. Okay, it could apply very well to immigrants. It could apply to all of you who are trying to figure out, what's my new professional identity and how does that fit into who I was beforehand. right? Integrating any kind of new aspect of your identity into yourself is always going to be a little bit of a negotiation, right? So in this case, you have your native religious culture, where you're deciding, is this something which I'm going to be keeping with me? Is this something that I'm going to be rejecting? Then you have the host culture of your new LGBT plus identity, right? And within that, is that something that I want to adopt within myself? Is that something that I want to reject and deny? Is that something that I even want to acknowledge? Is that something that I want to express? Okay, now again, the terminology is mostly going to be about people who are experiencing two different cultures, but you'll see it's a one-to-one application for what we're dealing with. First of all, people who feel rejected, both from where they came from and where they're trying to go, that would be called marginalization, right? Of course, marginalization is going to have negative predictions of any mental health in the long term, because that's a situation where everyone's going to be rejecting you. Okay, think about maybe a client of yours who they're not able to stand confidently in church because they feel that they themselves are inadequate, maybe even have a mark of Cain on them. But on the flip side, they don't feel comfortable in any kind of LGBT plus surroundings, because as soon as they walk in there, they feel like, oh, I'm too religious. Oh, this isn't consistent with me. Maybe they'll have a lot of complaints that I tried dating, but nobody works for me. Nobody understands all of me. The general feeling of, no matter where they end up, they feel very marginalized. Or maybe people who are trying to separate from where they came from, separate from the queer community and remain within the original culture. Okay, this would kind of be a story of a person or a phase that they're going through, where again, they are absolutely rejecting the queer community. Maybe you'll hear some statements that are a little bit judgmental, maybe repeating some lines that they've heard. And as long as I'm the person holding the pitchfork and I'm pointing at them, I'm still safe at home. And these would be the kinds of things where, you know, it could go anywhere from I want to be holy and therefore I will be abstinent, therefore I will be in the closet. I will be out of the closet, but I will show that I don't need to be like them. Okay, by and large, not being in a good situation with your host culture is something which is also a negative predictor of well-being, right? If you don't fit into wherever you're going, then you feel a constant state of, you know, trying to hold it together and trying to show that you're good enough. There's not enough empirical data to be able to say that that doesn't work for people who come out but then stay in their original community. I will say from many conversations that I've had with therapists about their experiences, it seems to be a very stagnant state for clients of theirs who are in that place. Where again, let's say, I know that I'm gay, I know that I'm not going to get married, I'm not going to start a family the way that maybe my community would want. So I'm going to stay, you know, the exact same way that I was when I was 20, because that's the paradigm that I know. On the flip side, someone who would maybe reject their native culture and try to adopt their host culture. Okay, the terminology for that would be assimilation within the cultural understanding of it that's very clear. And also when we talk about people who are struggling with these two different identities and these two different cultures, you'll hear maybe these people have a very negative view of where they were raised in the background from which they came. Maybe they would talk about, you know, it used to be relevant and then all of a sudden it wasn't. Okay, and finally, the people who are trying to do both, this is a place where, you know, it could be integration, it could be biculturalism. Maybe they're trying to go back to the verses and go out of their way to have a new queer reading of it. Maybe they're trying to, as I think it was, sorry, I don't have the names, Howard, right? As Howard mentioned, going back to it with a reading where you're trying to understand how everything works here and say, okay, this was a material reading of it. This is something which doesn't necessarily apply to me. Maybe even just your happy place being with other people who are trying to maintain both and are trying to struggle with both. I bring to you this framework because one of the things which I want all of you to appreciate when you're working with us here is that most people who are struggling to integrate multiple identities within themselves, they're not going to sit within one of these squares and say this is where they're going to statically remain the entire time. Usually the conversation is going to be much more dynamic. Usually it's going to have to be a situation where people are going to explore between them a lot more, right? So there's going to be a real interplay between how much they want to adopt and integrate the queer parts of themselves, how much they want to retain and maybe even strengthen the religious parts of themselves, and what their process is going to be to decide, is there space for both of these within me? Is there space for each of them to teach me more about the other? What does this actually look like in therapy? The first thing that I want to recommend in general is just basic skill building. Okay, in general, think about, I like to use the example of people getting a new professional training. Right at the beginning, let's say I'm a therapist, I'm sitting in the chair, and it is absolutely shocking to me that I'm the therapist and I'm the adult in the room. One of the things which really helps is learning what you're supposed to be doing and just doing it more often. Right, so certain things are going to be really helpful in therapies like this. Assertiveness training is something which is very often helpful for a lot of therapy where people who are struggling with their sexual and gender minority identities. Right, one thing in particular will be the difference between emotional reactivity versus emotion proactivity. Right, I want to come out to my mom. I'm absolutely certain that that is something that I want to do. But every time I'm about to, I get afraid, and because of my fear, I now don't. Once you do some clarifying, is it because you have some misgivings, things like that? No, it's because I want to express myself, but I feel the emotions in the moment, and I give in to the emotions in the short term instead of what will be helpful in the long term. Right? My siblings say something to me which is really not so sensitive to me, and I kind of lost it on them. And looking back on it, I'm sure I could have said it in a way which was less aggressive and more assertive. Less reactive in the moment, and more getting us to a place for where we want to be. So those kinds of skills are going to be really useful. Next, basic sex ed. Okay, anybody who's coming from most backgrounds, and certainly from a religious background, you can't rely on the fact that they're going to actually be informed for what it means to experiment, discover themselves, enter into a same-sex relationship at all. Okay, I always talk about the 4 C's: comfort, communication, consent, and contraception. And I'll say something which is especially important to remember and so critical to clarify, that if those things aren't there, it's their partner that is bad at sex. Okay, I know this is silly, and I know this is a little bit too explicit to talk about, but it's something which comes up in therapy, especially for younger people, but also anybody who's starting to discover. There's a lot of feeling of pressure to make sure that you're good at it, that you're succeeding at it. And very often that could lead to one of those 4 C's not being there as much as they're supposed to be. Okay, so it's very, very important that your client understands, first of all, how to choose whatever partners they're going to be with, because they don't necessarily know so much about it. And second of all, that they understand that if they are in a bad place, it's not their fault, it's their partner's fault. Okay, now I don't know how much this is in America, but I certainly know in Israel that in general, the more religious people are, the more their understanding of what intimacy looks like with same-sex partners looks more and more like they imagine Sodom to be. Okay, so you'll see a lot of times, let's say somebody who is ultra-Orthodox believe that there is supposed to be intimacy via love with opposite-sex partners and intimacy via aggression with same-sex partners. Okay, and that's something that you need to keep your finger on that pulse and be aware of. What's absolutely critical is making sure that you're gearing it towards your client's goals, right? Again, if they're coming in and they're saying, I'm really, punching back really hard, understand what they actually want and why they are punching back. And then based off of that, you'll be able to start working with them. Okay, it's very, very, very important that they don't even get a smell of the fact that you, representing the out group, are trying to impose your values onto them. Next, we can talk about question. For the most part, yes, but I will say it gets a lot more complicated, because at that point, gender is already playing a role. So let's say certainly within Judaism, 2 men being intimate with each other, specifically via anal sex, is much, much worse than 2 women being intimate with each other. So in that place, from a Jewish legal perspective, you would already see a difference there. I think in terms of people's general knowledge of how to act with intimacy in a way which is pleasurable for both and safe for both and responsible for both, you're going to see that across LGBTQ and plus. In general, people may already not be as educated in this point as they should. Maybe the system will only educate them before heterosexual marriage, so they never got that education. And now they're jumping into the deep end and they're assuming that they're supposed to be good at it because that's what this means. Okay, and this is a place where it's our job as therapists to kind of put the brakes on it, not in a way which is coming off sex negative or anything like that, but very much in a way which shows we care about your health, and therefore, sorry, but I'm going to give you the talk now. When we talk about identity formation, okay, which is what I was talking about in terms of, that acculturation square, is need for a playful space. I know that's, more of a dynamic term, but that's really what we're talking about here, right? It needs to be a space which is less structured, a space which allows people to jump between any of those four squares, even within a square, let's say to jump between assimilation versus bicultural versus feeling none of this makes sense to me. Usually, dialectic exercises are going to be really useful here, right? Think of a meditation of, instead of acceptance versus change, we can talk about holding two different parts of yourself, right? Holding your religious and your queer identities. A lot of times people in this situation have a really, really positive experience with mindfulness courses because of that exact point, where some of the exercises themselves encourage you to hold two different parts of yourself and understand that it is you who is holding it. Okay, similarly, any of these radical acceptance exercises, especially if there's some kind of internalized stigma, which assumes that you're supposed to feel ugly now. So radical acceptance exercises, very similar to chronic pain, may actually be useful here as well. If you want to get really into it, and this is something which I highly recommend if this is within your comfort zone, I understand that you all are familiar with the two chair, the empty chair exercise, right? So have fun with it. You can have people reenact two different parts of themselves and show that conversation, right? Either you from your past versus you in your present, the part of you which is angry at yourself, the part of you that wants to love yourself, the religious versus the queer parts of yourself. One thing which clients have found to be really useful if they're really struggling with what does God think about me is to put God in that chair, right? And speak from a first person of, this is what I feel like God is saying to me. And then give yourself a chance to respond out loud. Okay, now if you're going to do this exercise, obviously it doesn't need to be chairs, but it does need to be a creative space. Okay, so I personally have found it to be really successful if it's just letter writing back and forth. I happen to be in a dynamic practicum, so I said that was based off of Jung, because technically he did that too. But the main idea is that you want to, think about the process that you want your clients to go through, right? A playful space in order to try out the different parts of their identity, accept some, reject others, see how that feels, trial and error. And also very importantly, take that conversation and externalize it and make it more explicit. Okay, was that clear?
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Yeah, so I definitely think this exercise is fantastic for identity development and formation. One thing I'm always curious about with this exercise is application to either developmentally younger kids or kids on the autism spectrum. Have a lot of trouble with perspective taking in many cases, or just clients who have more trouble than the average person with perspective taking. Have you had to make any adaptations, or have you found any approaches particularly helpful in making this exercise more accessible for people with different levels of kind of perspective taking ability and metacognition?
So my main experience was actually at the opposite end, people who are especially expressive in certain ways. So, let's say the letter writing, that just came from a teenage client of mine who was very, very, very into writing fan fiction. And I tried getting into it with her, talking about The Hobbit and using that as a mode of interpretation. None of it worked until my supervisor and I realized that for her, it wasn't about the content itself, it was about the creative process. And that was what spoke to her, right? It wasn't The Hobbit, it was the writing about The Hobbit. And that's how we were able to apply it there. So while I don't have experience with, those particular things, I think as long as you remember what the basic processes are that you want to be more attuned to, there's space to bring it there. So let's say, even if it's not a matter of perspective taking, and you're going to take the perspective of you're a parent or a rabbi or a priest or something like that, there is space to say, okay, it sounds like there is a conversation here going on. Maybe if they're really young kids, can you have the dolls acted out with a puppet show or something like that, right? A game which they're used to playing. So now let's take what they're already doing and apply it to the process that we want them to go through.
Great, thank you so much.
Happily. And we're actually at the part where there's space for more questions as well. Because the main takeaway that I want you to take from this section, okay, is that any kind of identity process is complicated. And here we're talking about a double identity formation. Okay, so what that means in therapy is that we need to give them the space to, first of all, acknowledge that, their religious upbringing wasn't just a set of beliefs that they happen to have and now they believe others. No, this was an entire cultural upbringing that they just went through. It's an entire validation process. It's an entire system of morals. Something really real happened there, and it's a part of their identity. And on the flip side, their sexual or gender identity isn't just, one tangential part of them, which they need to acknowledge and say out loud and then move on with their life. This is also something which, the more that they acknowledge it, especially in light of, the community that they're part of, is going to be a part of their identity. How they're going to settle that and how they're going to work with all of that, that's going to be the question that therapy is here for. Okay, so thoughts, feelings, comments?
How do you feel hearing about this from a CBT perspective? Coming from that, I'm just wondering how folks are feeling and thinking about all of this from the perspective of being trained primarily in CBT-based therapies up to this point, and how this feels to imagine integrating it into what they're doing. I agree, and this almost seems like the formative work that needs to be done beforehand, in some ways.
And I'll say a big part of why I chose specifically these topics is because love the minority stress model, use it, and especially in a lot of the work that we're doing. One of the places where I think it really is lacking is that it only looks at people's religious backgrounds very often as an additional source of stress. And my issue with that is that that's really not something which is very consistent with the lived and expressed experiences of a lot of people who are dealing with those kinds of questions. You talk to people who come from a religious background. Yes, there are many additional sources of stress. I would say usually they are just more of the classic stressors. Every now and then we see something unique coming from their religious background. But on the flip side, the way that they talk about it usually is going to involve much more of a worldview and something which was formative of who they are. And so it's not really going to be the cognitive work necessarily of telling people what to think, more of the metacognitive work of working with them to understand how we're even going to think about it. So it's actually really interesting. My practicum site itself was within the ultra-Orthodox community. I came in assuming that would make me an expert in ultra-Orthodox psychology. I found in that particular case, 95% of the issues were just basic human issues. And then every now and then you would see something which really was unique. And I think that's going to be the same thing over here. Major overriding issues like, let's say, experiencing homelessness. Before you even get to the identity issues, we just have some basic roof over your head, food on your table issues. When we talk about people from diverse different kinds of backgrounds and how different people will approach this kind of question, I think that it's one of those situations where the within every group variance is going to be wider than any kind of between group variance. Okay, the difference between people within any group is going to be so wide. Then when you bring in people from other groups, again, from my personal clinical experience, it's part of it, but really everybody is so individual in that case that that's really the overriding experience of mine. Was that clear? I would say that there is so diverse. At this point, it's difficult to talk about trends in terms of differences between groups, differences, um, within different statuses. Meaning, I'm thinking, I could think of two different people, both of whom were ultra-Orthodox. One of them, their conclusion and, the last that I've heard from them, they're saying that, I've got the mark of Cain on me. It is what it is, and I'll try to hold it together and live by myself, and that's how I will end up. Another one was a woman who said, God wanted to send me in the world. I thought God wanted to send me into the world to, raise a God-fearing family, the way that, I imagined it up until now. But now I understand that that the entire reason why God sent me was to show I could raise a God-fearing family with two mothers. Right? So you could have two different people within the same group, and their conclusions for what God wants out of them could be completely divergent. And it's difficult for us to say which, we like more. We're here to be honest with them. We're here to hold them accountable. And we're here to find out what works for them, under the understanding that just like any worldview, we don't even know how static it's going to be long term. With a little bit of time that I have left, I do want to get a little bit into families. A lot of what I said before applies here as well, especially when you talk about sexual minorities. Something which is absolutely fascinating about it is that it's one of the only phenomena which is purely social. It happens all across every ethnicity, all across every socioeconomic status, and the effects are necessarily interpersonal. So let's say coming out of the closet, right? Neither actor within the situation as a person has changed, but something about their relationship very much has. Okay, and something that you hear a lot when you work with families, especially religious families of sexual and gender minorities, is that as soon as their kid comes out of the closet, now their family is in the closet. Okay, the difference is that the kid was someone who has already practiced this for a while, and they know how to negotiate it. The parents are now very concerned about what their neighbors are going to think, who they do tell, who they don't tell, how they negotiate, what they're going to disclose. Okay, and the positions of power is another case where it's going to be really dynamic and really subversive to the family dynamic. Okay, because on one hand, the parents are the ones who are in control of the approval, right? They say whether you're accepted into the family or not. But on the other hand, the child is the one who's in control of the knowledge here. They decide what to tell and what not to tell. They're the ones who will decide, if they tell their parents if they're going out at night or not. And this is one of the places where it's a real source of stress and really subversive to the family dynamic as a whole. Okay, I'll quickly give two overviews. Again, part of why I shared the PowerPoint with you. If you want to sit with it and look at the sources more, feel free. Okay, but one thing which families find incredibly, incredibly helpful is to give them permission to go through a grieving process. Okay, they're going to have a lot of mixed emotions. Maybe it's, what they feel like their community thinks versus what they actually think. Okay, look at a lot of the past dialectic work on that. In church, they're saying this, this, and this about my kid, but honestly, I feel something else entirely. A lot of meta emotional work is going to be necessary here. Okay, maybe shame about the fact that they feel shame, right? A lot of guilt. Very often parents will, especially religious parents, will blame themselves for the fact that their kid's life is now going to be harder, right? Maybe my child is gay because I'm divorced. I miss the Danielle that I raised, and now I have Daniel. And I love Daniel, but I miss Danielle, and I feel guilty about missing her. Right? Giving the parents some permission in order to feel that, especially within therapy, and especially separated from the kid themselves, lets them get that out of their system, and then already work towards more constructive emotions. Okay, so this is going to be a place where emotion-focused therapy, especially meta-emotional work, is going to come in a lot of handy. Okay, there's going to be a lot of talk with parents about how fair it is, whether they feel this way or not. Okay, did you end up reading the story that I sent out? Just yes, no? It's not a perfect story. It's a little bit problematic. And of course, having a child with disabilities is not as simple as, oh, it's not what I planned. Of course, there's a lot of complications. But the complicated emotions of, on one hand, grieving a lost dream that you had for your kid, and on the other hand, appreciating where they're at now is very, very reflective of the experience of a lot of parents in particular. Okay, and here again, if these are people who are more creative, then this is a wonderful place to engage with their creativity. Okay, sometimes you can have them, write new scripts out just verbally with you. And if it's a situation where, let's say, maybe many parents will engage with religious texts, so they don't have to do it with you in the room, but a certain homework assignment could be to read the texts which are difficult to themselves, see where that takes them, and kind of do a cognitive diffusion exercise with the text themselves that they find to be so painful. Right, so reading it over, repeating it, seeing what insights they get out of that, and then bringing all of that back into therapy. One more approach, and this one is already being researched, so it's on its way towards empirical support, is being done in the lab of Gary Diamond here in Israel at Ben Gurion University. Okay, where what they do is they separate the parents from the kids for many of the sessions. They work with them in parallel, and then they bring them back together in order to focus on specifically ruptures in their relationships. This therapy itself, you only get to join the trial if the kid came out of the closet and has already been out for 2 years, and the family dynamics are still broken. So it's really families that are stuck in ways which they acknowledge are maladaptive. So some of the points for working with that are, first of all, moving past all the meta emotions and working back into the basic emotions themselves. You feel guilty about missing your daughter, and now you have to acknowledge your son, but also you love your son. Okay, instead of getting in your head and going into any kind of metacognitive cycles about it, acknowledge those relationships themselves and how important they still are for you. When they're apart, especially, let them get all of those complicated emotions out of their way, and then coach them for ways to express it more effectively. And then bring them back together in order to facilitate that conversation within the family, and specifically have a focus on their relationship. When I came out, you reacted as such, and this is how I felt about our relationship together. I don't remember if I mentioned it, I didn't. Something which families very often need to hear, okay, is that, the rejection sensitivity literature, if y'all are familiar with that, pretty much saying that, back to the Danielle example, Daniel doesn't know if you love Daniel or if you only loved Danielle. Okay, they don't know it. And you say, of course I love my child. I love my child no matter what. Okay, Daniel doesn't know that. And if all you can do at this point is tell your kid that you love them, you should know that for them, that's a real statement. They don't know anything. They don't make any assumptions. Okay, so coach them with that separately. And then when it's time to bring them back together for a facilitated conversation, stick on the real baselines of things that we can all agree on, because nothing is self-evident. Okay, so the final takeaway that I want to give you, and then we've got about 9 minutes left for a little bit of a longer discussion, is that when we talk about families, I understand that Hollywood really wants to, paint the family members, maybe it's a bad guy who sends their kid to conversion therapy and they're cross-wielding and all. That's just not the experience of most families. Most families are filled with good people who genuinely love their kids and are just really, really scared that their kids aren't going to be all right and that they're going to lose them. Okay, let's say conversion therapy is a much bigger issue within religious communities. I've found it to be much less common for it to be bad people sending their kids to conversion therapy, and much more common for good parents who are genuinely concerned to fall prey to charlatans. Okay, it's really important that parents themselves even understand that, right? That's communicated to them very clearly, and if they can really internalize the fact that maybe there are ways that they've reacted and ways that they're trying to work through their own new identities, which aren't going to be clean and aren't going to be as they would want to feel. That's okay. Work through it. Again, a lot of dialectical work, a lot of meta-emotional work. And then when it comes time for everyone to have a conversation together, make sure that everyone's been coached and they understand that we're just talking about a basic level. We're not going to let things spiral. And as long as things are able to stay on that level, it tends to be pretty effective. The stories coming out of Gary's lab are really fantastic. We're waiting to see what the numbers are themselves, but we are on our way to having an empirically supported intervention for even that specific issue. Okay, I'll just show one last thing while we still have time. If you are interested in hearing more, I tweet about it tons. You're welcome to, oops. There we go. You're welcome to email me if you want to. It's hot off the presses, but we ran a conference over at the Hebrew University and actually raised extra money to get it with translated with English subtitles. Okay, so if you click on that link, that will actually take you over to Professor Diamond's lecture on family therapy for religious families of sexual and gender minorities. And it'll give you also the playlist of all sorts of other, I think, really interesting lectures that we had in it. How to explain LGBT plus to people from conservative backgrounds, a rabbi speaking about social issues, an Orthodox therapist talking about how she had, as a Orthodox Jewish woman, puts together affirmative therapy. So if you're interested, it's there and available. Of course, I'm around. And we've got a little bit more time for a little bit more discussion if anybody wants to. Therapy, it always has to be adapted. You know, that just is what it is. I would say that there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Okay, first of all, the things which we should do. Ask, check what's going on, ask on a basic level, what are they experiencing physiologically, things like that. First of all, a lot of times, especially conversion therapists will say that's all that they're doing, but really they'll be asking in a very directed direction. That's something, especially within religious communities, maybe somebody's priest says that they're experienced with it, and they'll be asking, are you questioning, but give a leading answer. So first of all, when you have people who are asking around and looking into different things, that's just a little potential red flag to keep in the back of your head in case something like that comes up. Second of all, something to keep in mind is that even if you are, ostensibly part of the in-group, you are, let's say they're Christian, wearing a cross and being very clear about the fact that you're part of that. If you're not explicitly recommended by some kind of community leader, you're probably going to be at least suspect, if not likely, part of the out-group. So you need to be really, really careful there to guide people or push people too much in a direction, right, where they think, oh, okay, Dr. Sullivan is just putting his values onto me, right? And it's very, very easy to fall into that trap just when we talk about technique, right? One potential solution there is that experience is something which is really useful, and meeting other people who are like you from a similar background and seeing, are these people that I could identify with or not? Let's say they're queer and Jewish. There's plenty of organizations available in New York, in Israel, LA, all around the world. And that's, something which is potentially a low stakes game, right? Okay, go meet these people, talk to them about their experiences, how they integrate their queerness with their Judaism. Does that ring true to you? And if that's something that you're not willing to do because you're afraid of where that's going to take you, okay, now we acknowledge that this is where you're at, right? So this is going to be one of those places where, I wouldn't call it behaviorist in terms of behavioral learning, right? But it's really a place where giving people concrete homework